Okay, good morning. So we're here towards the in the middle, towards the end of chapter 29 on page 397.
96.
Right, we'll start. We'll do the last paragraph or two
Okay.
just to get into it. But the end of page 396, third to last paragraph, I think. And I posed the question. I think, if I remember correctly, I posed the question at the end of last lesson. Choice. Can you compel someone to have free choice, or can you compel someone and claim that the person has free choice at the same time? So it seems to be a non-starter, right? If you're compelling them, then it's not their choice. And if it's their choice, you're not compelling them.
Not guide, compel.
Huh? Compel.
Guide people.
No,
in the right
compel.
direction.
Compel. We're talking about compelling. So there is an interesting law. There's a mitzvah of divorce, not a mitzvah to get divorced. There's a mitzvah related to divorce. You know, just can't be too clear nowadays. But when it comes to divorce, there is a mitzvah. And the mitzvah is if a man divorces his wife, there's a procedure that needs to happen. And the procedure is that the husband writes a bill of divorce to sever any tie with his wife. It doesn't work the other way. The woman can't write a bill of divorce severing ties with her husband and giving it to the husband. This is how the Torah writes it, that the husband writes a bill of divorce to his wife. What happens if the husband refuses to do this? The woman wants a divorce, and the husband refuses to write the bill of divorce.
She can't get remarried.
Oh, she can't get remarried, and it's a big problem, especially if it's an acrimony. You know, it's a very contentious relationship. The husband may want to spite the wife, and refuse to give her a bill of divorce. In Israel, after a certain, depending on the situations, you can be imprisoned if you refuse to give until you give a bill of divorce. But only in unique situations. However, you can't force the husband to write a bill of divorce. You can't, compel him in any way, shape, or form, because it has to be him writing it from his will. He has to desire it. He has to want it, and he has to do it. However, this is all talking about cases in which the woman wants a divorce. What about if the husband needs to divorce? There are certain cases in which the husband is not allowed to live with his wife anymore. He must divorce her. Very rare situation, but there are such scenarios. And here, again, he refuses to divorce his wife.
Was this after they decided that they couldn't have multiple wives?
No.
Because if they can have multiple wives, they keep getting married. They don't
No, because the wife can't live with him, and she can't remarry anyone else. He can marry someone else, but she can't.
Oh, yeah.
Right, so she becomes a living widow.
A living widow.
Because she can't live with her husband. She also can't marry anyone else. So she's like a widow, but it's a living widow. It's like it's a widow with a living husband,
Right.
like this. So you're stuck. You can't do anything. It's a terror. By the way, there's another option of this happening, and that is when a man disappears. And this was something that after 9/11 became a big thing. That there were bodies that couldn't be found. The woman can't remarry because she's married, and you need proof. You need to see you need to know that the person died.
And that's why
Plane crashes, people that get lost in plane crashes, or it used to be in war. You got lost in
the
war.
military went to war.
They gave conditional divorces to their husbands. King David's army, they conditionally divorced their wives before they went to war, just in case they never came back. Yeah. So, and by the way, this is something that's very relevant today in the Israeli army. You know, in case they can't recover bodies, what do? How, do they need witnesses? Do they need, what type of proof do you need? How much blood or DNA do you need to prove that this person no longer is alive? You know, it's very, very relevant in certain scenarios today. Okay, so here Maimonides says, when a man, it's not inside, I'm reading from Maimonides, the laws of divorce. When a man whom the law requires to be compelled to divorce his wife does not desire to divorce her, he needs to desire, right? The court should have him beaten until he consents, at which time they should give a written get. And this get is acceptable. Wait, why? They beat him till he said yes. You think he wants it? That's not. So this is what I asked for. How do you can you compel someone to have free choice? Seems a little odd, yeah. Similarly, if the Gentiles beat him, in other words, if they're living in a place where the court doesn't have the authority to beat him, so the non-Jewish authorities beat him and they tell him, do what the Jews are telling you to do. And the Jews have the Gentiles apply pressure on him until he consents to divorce his wife, the divorce is acceptable. If, however, the Gentiles compel him to write a get on their own initiative, in other words, they want him to divorce, then it's not acceptable. Why? Because the law requires him to want to give the divorce. Wait, so what happens if the Jewish court forces him? Or if the Jews have the Gentiles force him, then it is a get. It is a good divorce. But if the Gentiles do it on their own, then it's not a good divorce. What's going on over here? So that Maimonides says, why is this get not the, you know what a get is, right?
Yeah.
Jewish bill, you know what? Yeah. Why is this get not void? For he is being compelled either by Jews, or by the Gentiles based on the Torah law to divorce against his will, and a get must be given voluntarily. So why is this? Because the concept of being compelled against one's will applies only when speaking about a person who is being compelled and forced to do something that the Torah does not obligate him to do. For example, a person who was beaten until he consents to a sale. Yeah, I want your car and I'm going to beat you until you sell me. Or to give a present. I force you to give a present. If, however, a person's evil inclination presses him to negate the observance of a mitzvah or to commit a transgression, here the Torah says you have to divorce. And the husband refuses to do what the Torah says. Right? So then he was beaten until he performed the action he was obligated to perform. Right? He was obligated to give the divorce. Now he's beaten until he does it. Or disassociated himself from forbidden action. Either way, he is not considered to have been forced against his will. On the contrary, it is he himself who is forcing his own conduct to become debased. In other words, what Maimonides is saying here, a Jew, and this is the first time we have this concept of a subconscious. A Jew subconsciously wants to do whatever God tells him to do. The fact that you have a Jew who the Torah says must give a divorce and he refuses, here he's putting up a fight against himself. In other words, deep inside, he wants to do exactly what the Torah says. He wants to give the get. But his evil inclination is sort of ganging up against his true essence. So when we beat him, all we're doing is peeling away the enemy, peeling away the externalities. And once he consents, that's his true self talking. Because the true self of the individual wants to do exactly what God says. You may not be aware of it, but you have a soul that wants to do exactly what God wants.
When somebody does finally do the divorce, what happens to the support of the woman, and what about kids?
Well, the divorce, a person when he gets married writes a ketubah. The ketubah has provisions that provide monetarily to a woman after she's divorced.
Oh, it's in the ketubah.
That's what a ketubah is. The first.
Yeah, I know.
It's a legal document.
Yeah,
that's
it's a wedding license, but
no, it's not a wedding license. We don't have a wedding license.
it's just
No,
contract?
it's a rabbinic construct.
oh, okay.
It's a rabbinic construct that guarantees the rights of the woman in case the marriage dissolves or in case he dies.
Oh, okay.
So there's a minimum amount of money that he has to provide to her if he divorces her or if he dies before her, that the estate has to give to her, and to provide for her, if she has children from a previous marriage, to provide for those children as well. For his own children, it's his obligation, even if they divorce. It doesn't matter who has the kids. It's his obligation to provide for his children. We don't need the ketubah for that. The ketubah protects the rights of the woman, both in the marriage, but those are Torah obligations. They're just confirmed in the marriage. But primarily, and that's why it says a husband and wife are not allowed to live together without a ketubah. Because if there's no ketubah, then there's really nothing holding him back from divorcing her. The ketubah puts a big financial burden on him if he divorces her. So he's going to think twice before he divorces her, yeah? So that's not a problem. Now, if the woman does something to compel the divorce, then obviously she loses the right to her ketubah, right? If the woman is unfaithful and then he's forced to divorce her because he can't live with her anymore, so then she loses, she did something, she lost the right to her ketubah, he doesn't have to pay her. But 99% of the time, or any other time that, whether it's her idea or his idea, whatever it is, as long as he's not compelled to divorce her, if he divorces her, there's a monetary obligation that's there to protect her. Yeah. So here we see a fascinating thing, right? We see a fascinating thing that we have this subconscious that wants to do one thing, even if the person doesn't feel that's what they want to do. Now, in this whole chapter we've been talking about, right? We've been talking about a person who the fire of God, the fire of his godly soul isn't catching on to his body, to his animal soul, right? So what was the remedy? So just like if you have a log that's too thick for the fire to catch on, what do? You chop it up, you break it up. So we went through this whole process where we're trying to beat up the body, beat up the person, the animal soul, to get the fire to catch on to it. So what's real? Is klipa? We all remember what klipa is? What's not God? What's not godliness? Right? The shell, the thing that covers over God. Is klipa real as godliness? Or is it like you have light and dark? What's stronger, light or darkness? Light. The proof is in the pudding, right? All you need is put a little light and a lot of darkness goes away. Darkness is the absence of light. Yep. So you would think that if I know the truth will always come up on top. So if I know the truth, shouldn't I be automatically spared from falsehoods? Shouldn't I be protected from all of the desires of my animal soul if I know the truth that my godly soul wants God and that's my essence? Why is it that that's not always the case, right? We may know the truth, we may know God exists, we may know that the Torah says do this and don't do this, and yet I still want to do it. If you can take a truth that's more practical in the world we live in, yeah, the truth is that if the tank in your car, if all the gas is depleted, your car is not going to go, right? That's the truth. You know that for a fact. So when you're driving down the highway and the gas light goes on and it's been already 40 miles and you know soon it's going to be empty, and you see a gas station off the exit, but it's very expensive. You see the prices are hiked. But if you go another couple miles, it's much cheaper. What are you going to do?
Well, no, you probably get off because
If you're certain that
You don't have to fill the tank.
right, if you're certain, why? Because you know the truth. You know that if there's no gas, miracles aren't going to happen. We don't rely on miracles, yeah. So why is it that if I know that for my health, I can't eat salt? I know that. I know I'm putting myself in danger if I do. Why would I do it? If I know the truth, right? Why would I do? Where's the disconnect? Here's the problem. Here's the problem. The problem is that klipa, or the shell that covers godliness, where does that come from? God created it, right? If God created it, that means it's not like darkness. That's just the absence of light. It has something. God created it.
Yeah.
However, God didn't create it to be an end in of itself. God didn't create it so that it should have that it should live forever. God created it so that we should fight it. So it's real. It's not like darkness that once I know the truth, everything else falls apart. Right? If you know Hebrew, so the word for truth in Hebrew is emet. Aleph, mem, taf. Aleph has two legs on the bottom, right? The mem has a flat bottom, and the taf has two legs. Okay, so they each can stand on their own. You know what the word for falsehood or false in Hebrew is? Sheker. Sheker. That's the word for a falsehood in Hebrew. Now, in the Torah, the way a shin is written, it has a pointy bottom. Kuf has one leg here, one leg here. Not very, and a resh only has one leg on the side.
So it's not stable.
It's not stable. It falls over. Yeah.
Ah,
In other words, if something is really, really real and something else is really, really fake or really false, there's no battle. But here, the falsehood is a godly construct. God created this falsehood. However, God created it so that we should overcome it. We should overpower it. But it's still real. And therefore, it could it's not so out of the question that we should think, wait, well, I studied Torah, I know what's right and wrong. How come I'm still having a difficult time doing this? Well, because God's creating an obstacle. And He wants you to overcome the obstacle. But God created the obstacle. Don't think it's nothing. And that's why we learn that if a person's heart is a stone, right? The knowledge that you know and the feelings that you have aren't penetrating. They're not igniting the fire. We have to break it up into little pieces. You can't go and argue. Can't go and use logic necessarily, because you know the truth. It's not about convincing the animal soul that this is the right thing. The animal soul knows what's the right thing. You studied it in class. You know exactly what to do. Why is this? We'll see soon. Why is it that a person can be in a position where he knows the truth and yet doesn't think that maybe, thinks he can get away with something else? We'll see. But it's real because this is a godly creation. We have to deal with it properly. Okay, let's see. So page 396 in the bottom. So we're going to start from the third to last paragraph. We just finished the sort of the speech that the person gives his animal soul of how right? We say, you are truly evil and wicked, abominable, loathsome, and disgraceful, using all the epithets by which our sages have called. In other words, you call it every name in the book, yeah? So after this, in this way, he will help his divine soul, enlightening its eyes to perceive the truth of the unity of the infinite light of the Ein Sof. As though, it'll be as real as though with physical sight, and not merely through the lesser perception of hearing and understanding. For as explained elsewhere, this is the core of the whole divine service. In other words, the core of the divine service is that it shouldn't be something that, I know I was told that, God exists and that it should be something I see. It's clear as daylight to me. It takes a lot of effort to go from the position of hearing to seeing. And that's the point of divine service. Divine service means to make God real to me in a way that I could see it and not just hear it. That the Jews saw what they were able to hear and heard what they were usually able to see. Yeah. Very good. Now, the reason that humbling the spirit of the Sitra Achra. Sitra Achra is, remember, the other side is effective in crushing it. Because why is it that if you beat up the Sitra Achra, it's effective? Yeah? Humbling it. Why is it? Is that in truth, there is no substance whatsoever in the Sitra Achra. That is why it is compared to darkness, which has no substance whatsoever and is automatically banished by the presence of light. Because it's untrue. It's not real. Similarly with the Sitra Achra. Indeed, but yet God created it. So it does have something, yeah? Indeed, it possesses abundant vitality with which to animate all the impure animals and the souls of the nations of the world, and also the animal soul of the Jew, as has been explained. Yet, this vitality is not its own. It doesn't have its own independent existence, God forbid, but stems from the realm of holiness. For the realm of holiness is the source of all life, including even the life force of the Sitra Achra, as has been explained above. It's almost like you can have like a training course for a policeman, for a soldier, right? They put obstacles, enemies in the training course, but those enemies are provided by the army itself, right? So they're not real enemies, but they're perceived as enemies. You know, they're real for the purposes of which the army put them into place. So here, the Sitra Achra is darkness. It's not real. Nothing the Sitra Achra says is true. It's all falsehoods. It's going to take you down a crazy path. Don't listen to a word it says. So why is it here? Because God put it here. Yeah? And so where does its life come from? Its life comes from godliness, from holiness. Therefore, yeah.
But without that, you really don't have freedom of choice. You could follow Sitra Achra if you want to, Achra, or you could follow the light. So you follow darkness or follow the light. So God is making sure you have a choice.
Exactly.
You know, He's putting that choice there for you.
Exactly.
But you have to decide which way to go.
Exactly. Now, when you study enough, you know that the Sitra Achra is just like in all areas in life, there's two choices. You could go to college, you cannot go to college, you could get a job, you could stay home. You know what the right choice is. And yet it could be a struggle. The more you convince yourself of the right choice, the easier it'll be to overcome the struggle. But sometimes it's still not easy to overcome the struggle. And then you got to beat yourself up and give yourself a rude awakening. I better do this or else I'm finished. And then you get up and you leave and you go work. Yeah. The same thing here. Same idea. Therefore, it is completely nullified in the presence of holiness, as darkness is nullified in the presence of physical light. Its power lies only in the fact that in regard to the holiness of man's divine soul, God has given it permission, the Sitra Achra, given it permission and ability to raise itself against it. So God allows it to look real to the eyes of the person in order that man should be roused to overpower it and to humble it by means of the humility and submission of the spirit and by being abhorrent and despised in his own eyes. For through this he humbles the Sitra Achra and abhors it. Now, this arousal of man below to crush the Sitra Achra causes an arousal from above to fulfill what is written, from there will I bring you down, says God. In other words, God's speaking to the Sitra Achra, which seeks to rise against godliness and to obscure it. God says, I'll take it down. You do your part, I'll do the rest. I'll make sure Sitra Achra becomes a non-issue for you and becomes non-existent for you. This means that he deprives it of its dominion and power and withdraws from it the strength and authority which had been given it to rise up against the light of the holiness of the divine soul. And thereupon it automatically becomes nullified and is banished, just as darkness is nullified before physical light. The Alter Rebbe is going to give an example of this from the Torah that we didn't, in the book of Numbers. One second. Sorry about that. There's actually a nice metaphor because we're talking here about a number of things that we discussed other times and elsewhere. How the difference between hearing and seeing, right? The difference between hearing something and seeing something that you grow up. If you have a good, you're raised with a good education, especially if you're Jewish and you're raised with a Jewish education, more or less, that there's a God, what God expects of you, what God wants from you. Even if you don't know all the details of all the commandments, more or less you know that there are plenty of times during the day I make choices. I'd be better off if I made other choices, right? But all of that is only in the realm of hearing. I know it to be, I was told. It's not sitting in front of me as if it's something I could see. There's a metaphor that's given of in the olden days, a guy leaves town, which almost never happened. He never left town. He leaves town, he goes to a faraway land, and he comes back, and he tells all his friends that he saw a new type of bird, different species of bird. And this bird, its head looks like a human head, and the body looks like the body of a lamb, a sheep. People think he's crazy. First of all, they don't believe a word he's saying. That makes no sense. But he convinces them and he describes it to them. It's really falling on deaf ears. Some people want to believe him. A few years later, someone else goes to this place, comes back, and they ask him, "No, you saw this bird?" He says, "Yeah, I saw the bird. The head isn't exactly like a human bird, like a human head. It has some characteristics, but it's not as big. It's not as this. It's not as that. And the body doesn't look exactly like a lamb. It looks like this." Yeah, he made it more in the realm of possibility. So here, more people believe him. They still have a very hard time imagining such a bird. And there's still some people that are skeptical. And then a number of years later, another person goes to this place, comes back, and this time he brings back one of the birds. And now everyone sees exactly what's going on, exactly what it is. So this metaphor was once given for Jewish mysticism, for Kabbalah. First came the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He wrote the Zohar. In the Zohar, things are very abstract, very hard to understand for us to understand the spiritual ideas that are spoken about there. Then came the Arizal. The Arizal brought it more down, brought it further down to our human materialistic sensibilities that we, to give metaphors and things that we can sort of relate to. And then the Baal Shem Tov in Chassidus, Baal Shem Tov taught us, God's right here. All you have to do is look around. You'll see it. It's here. You don't need to be told. You don't need to believe something abstract. You just need to look around and see it. And yet, when we look around, we don't necessarily see it. But if we work on ourselves, this is part of serving God, is to work on yourself to shift the balance. The balance by default is that sort of 95, the world is like 95% real. God's real, but it's sort of like a novelty. It's not God isn't as real as the world. The point of divine service is to switch it around. God should become more real than the world. The only way to do that is to see godliness. How do you see it? You obviously can't see it with your eyes. How do you see it? You experience it. You live it to the point of that it becomes as real as seeing. And if you have a problem, if it's not working, then you got to give a little beating to the body to refine it a little, to make it, they go to boot camp, right? What do they do in boot camp? They break you. But they don't break you because they want a broken person. They break you because they want a strong person. Why is a kid that goes to boot camp, why are they not soldier material? Because they've got an ego. An ego. You can't listen to orders to jump into fire if you've got an ego. You got to break the ego. You got to break your sense of self, not because you don't have worth. On the contrary, if you want to contribute what you're truly worth, you can't let ego get in the way. Let's look for a second. We'll soon see it inside. That we'll speak about. But let's go back for a second. We all know the story of the spies. Yeah, we know the story more or less. So the Jewish people are in the desert for about a year, a little over a year, and they're supposed to be there for 7 weeks. They get the Torah and then they move to Israel. Right? That was the point. That was the point of the journey. The problem is, after they receive the Torah, they worship the golden calf. And then starts a whole period of 120 days that Moses has to go up the mountain 3 times to ask forgiveness and to receive the Torah. And then God tells them to build a tabernacle to atone for the sin of the golden calf. And then they finally erect the tabernacle, the second Passover. In other words, the 1-year anniversary of the Exodus of Egypt. And then after Passover, the plan is to go to Israel. What happens after Passover? The Jewish people decide, before they go to Israel, they want to send spies to figure out if this is military, how to go about conquest. And so Moses sends spies, and you would imagine the spies are thinking to themselves, what's the point of spying? To have a military strategy. We have to do this scientifically, so they go, they make their scientific assessments, and they come back with a pretty accurate, in their mind, scientific analysis that, based on what we saw there and based on what we've got no chance. Look, they think they're grasshoppers. They saw giants and they said we looked like grasshoppers to them. In other words, we have no chance against these people. The problem was science makes analysis. Science doesn't come to conclusions. Right? Science analyzes things. Based on the science, we could try to figure out how certain things work. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes we find that the analysis was flawed. Sometimes it takes 150 years to find out the analysis was flawed. Yep. And here also the spies overstepped their authority. Moses sent them to go find out the best possible way to get into Israel. Moses didn't ask them to come back with a conclusion. No, he asked them for a strategy, not with a conclusion that it's not possible. And they came back and said, God can do. Even it says, "Chazakumi menu." It's too strong for him. As they implied, even God can't conquer this. That's what it seems like. And what happens? They're convinced. They're convincing, and all the Jewish people are convinced that they're being led on a suicide march. And so they all start crying. And what happens? God says, "You guys think you're going to die here? You will die here. Your children will go in to the land of Israel in 40 years. You have to stay here for 40 years to die out. In 40 years, your children, who you thought you're leading to the slaughter, they'll enter the land and conquer the land." Yeah. But something very interesting happened that the next day, or I think the next morning, the Jewish people had a change of heart. They said, "Let's go back." And now let's go back. Forget about what we said yesterday. Let's go to the land of Israel. Moses is not so fast. Now God said, "Stay here." Now God's not going with you. You go by yourself. Now you're on your own. But what happened? What changed their minds? Last night they were convinced they're being led on a suicide march. We're not going. This morning they're ready to go. What happened in between? So if you look in the Torah, you'll see there were no major miracles that happened, sort of to convince them God's capable of doing this. There was also no miracle or even logical discussion that Moses had with them to point out the fallacy of their arguments or to show them how they're wrong. None of that happened. What happened? Moses goes down on them. And Moses, right? What does Moses say? He just tells them how angry God is with them. And suddenly they shifted their whole approach. We know other times that the Jews had to be proven of something, and people perform miracles, right? Elijah, right? When Elijah has the Jewish people bowing down to idols, he makes this whole performance on the mountain, right? This whole contest with you know the story? The whole contest with the priests of the Baal, of the idolatry, and he brings down this fire from heaven, it consumes his animal. Everyone says, this guy's the real deal. Yeah. Korach, the rebellion of Korach, right? Korach rebels against Moses. The Jewish people are sort of intrigued. What quashed the rebellion? Moses makes a contest. Let's bring incense, and whoever's incense God accepts, they're the real deal. The miracle happened. And then an even greater miracle happens. The earth opens up and swallows up Korach and his men. I mean, now the Jews are convinced. But Moses didn't do any of that here. Moses took a different approach. He didn't argue with them. He didn't try to persuade them with miracles or with big things. What did he do? He just yelled at them. Do you guys realize what he just did? God's so upset at you, he wants to kill all of you. Now, what are the chances that someone who is in that type of state and you start yelling at them how God is so upset at them, what are the chances they're actually going to listen to you? What are the chances that Moses would have scared them off and they would say, oh, God's so upset at us, we better get out quickly. God's not even protecting us now. How did it work? How did Moses rebuking them work in this situation? To the extent that within a few hours, they had a whole 180-degree turnaround. So here's something that we know for sure. They didn't lack faith in God. They were believers, right? They followed God into a desert, not knowing where they're going to eat, drink, or have shelter from. They believed. Yeah. They also had logic. They saw the splitting of the sea. They saw God's miracle. They knew God could take care of them. So what happened there? How did they get so delusional to think that God can't conquer the land of Israel for them? What happened was ego. Moses picks them and says, go to the land and spy it, figure out how to conquer it. In other words, what are they thinking? God needs us to come back with an analysis. That means my opinion's important. Once ego got involved, they got lost in it. They got lost in it and they came back giving opinions that they were never asked for. We're going to decide whether God can do this or not. Moses saw that. Moses saw right through that. And Moses sees ego. He says, no miracle is going to help. No logical argument's going to be able to break through the skull of someone who is all about himself. Moses had to break the ego. So Moses says, you know what you guys just did? You know how upset you made God? Moses is trying to break them. He's trying to break their spirits. Not break them, they should become broken people. To break their spirit, to break their ego, to allow God to come back out, to allow the faith he knew was in there to become real again. And what happened? It's pretty good. Pretty good experiment. The next morning, they all said, we're back on track. We want to go to Israel now. There's a metaphor that's given of a wagon driver. He's a horse and buggy. He's someone hired him to take him to the next town, and on the way, the wagon driver becomes very tired, and he turns to the passenger and he says, "Listen, I got to take a nap. I can't do this anymore. But if you want to get to the city in time, maybe you want to take over so we don't lose any time in our travel." So the guy says, "Okay, but I have no idea how to treat a horse. What do I do? How do I do anything?" He says, "You don't worry. You just steer the horses on the road." And he gives them his whip and he says, "And if they act up, let them know that you have the whip and you'll be fine." He hands over the reins, he goes to sleep, and after a few minutes, the horses realize that they're being led by someone they can manipulate. And so they start to slow down until they come to a stop. And the guy's, so he gets off the horse, he gets off the buggy, goes to the horse, and he whispers in the horse's ear that he has a whip. The horses are just standing, they're not going anywhere. So he picks up his whip and he shows it to them. They're just standing there. So he starts yelling and screaming at the horse. They're not budging. But meanwhile, he wakes up the wagon driver. The wagon driver's looking at him. He's like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I'm trying to let them know I have the whip." So the wagon driver said, "That's not how you talk to a horse. You got to give it a whip, and that's how you remind it that you have the whip." Sometimes you can speak to the person and remind him that you have the whip. Sometimes the person, that doesn't talk to them. You have to give them the whip. You have to know how to talk to. If the person is covered up by his animal soul, he's got an animal, he's got a horse, then you got to whip it. You got to beat it up. Not physically, you got to beat it up. You got to take away its sense of ego, its sense of self, because it's really not real. All it is to serve, is to be a tool to serve God with, or to obstruct the view of God so that I can overpower it. But if it thinks that it's got a life of its own, that's dangerous. You got to break it up. Okay, let's see here the metaphor inside. The last paragraph on 398. Indeed, we find this explicitly stated in the Torah in connection with the spies sent by Moses to scout out the Holy Land. At the outset, they declared, "For he, the enemy, is stronger than we." And interpreting the word mimenu, in other words, that he, the enemy, is stronger than we, they said we, but really the word for we is mimenu, but really it means he. The sages say, "Read not then we, but then he," meaning that they had no faith in God's ability to lead them into the Holy Land. But afterward, the next day, they reversed themselves and announced, "We will readily go up to conquer the land." So the Alter Rebbe's question is, whence did their faith in God's ability return to them? What happened? Our teacher Moses, peace unto him, had not shown them in the interim any sign or miracle concerning this, which would restore their faith, you would think. He had merely told them that God was angry with them and had sworn not to allow them to enter the land. So what value did this divine anger and oath have to them if in any case they did not believe in God's ability to subdue the 31 kings who resigned in the land at the time? No, if they don't believe in God's power, what do they care? For which reason they had no desire whatsoever to enter the land. What happened? Surely then, the explanation is as follows. Israelites themselves are believers, being the descendants of believers. In other words, inherently, internally, you believe, whether you like it or not. Even when while they stated the enemy is stronger than he, sort of they're not believing in the power of God, their divine soul still believed in God. They professed a lack of faith in his ability only because the Sitra Achra, clothed in their body, in the person of their animal soul, had risen against the light of the holiness of the divine soul with its characteristic impudent arrogance and haughtiness, without sense or reason. Haughtiness doesn't have any reason, right? A person, when they pick themselves up and it's haughtiness, it's not real. It's based on hot air. There's no rhyme or reason for that. Therefore, as soon as God became angry with them and thundered angrily, "How long shall I bear with this evil congregation? Your carcasses shall fall in this wilderness. I, God, have spoken. I will surely do it unto all this evil congregation." So he's rebuking them. So when God said this, their heart was humbled and broken within them when they heard these stern words, as it is written, "And the people mourned greatly." Consequently, the Sitra Achra toppled from its dominion, from its haughtiness and arrogance. But the Israelites themselves, in other words, as far as the divine soul is concerned, had believed in God all along. Because remember, the person has two identities, two souls. So the fact that, like, for example, the husband says, I don't want to divorce my wife, that's only one part of him talking. The other part says, I want to divorce my wife because that's what the Torah says I have to do. The problem is that soul, that voice is sleeping. It's not a voice, it's not just a voice. It's who he is. It's a personality. With the intellect, with emotions, with, right? This is a real person. Okay, so before we continue, we finish this last page. There is a story in the Talmud that is very odd, an odd story, and impossible. And we'll try to explain it in a Hasidic light or in a spiritual light. It doesn't take away from the oddity of the story, the simple story, but either way. The Talmud tells the story of, so we spoke before about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the author of the Zohar. So he had a son. His son was Rabbi Lazar. They had to hide in a cave for 13 years, hiding from the Romans who wanted to kill him. And him and his son hid in the cave for 13 years. So one day, Rabbi Lazar is walking down the street and he sees an ugly person. That's what the Talmud says. And he stops him and he says, oh, how ugly you are. Are all the people in the city you come from this ugly? Again, sounds like a weird thing for any person to say, let alone a rabbi at the stature of Rabbi Lazar bar Shimon. So the person responds to him, go to the craftsman who made me. So the Talmud says that Rabbi Lazar realized what happened, so he asks for forgiveness. Back and forth. Finally, the man forgives him on the condition that he'll be more careful in the future in the way he speaks to people. And obviously, the question is, what's the Talmud telling us here? Even the Torah will say the animal which isn't pure, to avoid saying impure animal. In other words, to avoid saying the word impure, and that adds an extra 8 letters in the Torah. So the Torah is very careful to use positive speech. And here, the Torah is telling us this sort of negative story about it. The Torah doesn't tell us 99% of this person's life. And the story they chose to tell us is this one story where he's sort of portrayed as not a nice person. And the Talmud puts him up on a pedestal. He's one of the sages of the Talmud. So obviously, he wasn't this ridiculous type of person. So the Rebbe spoke about this once, and the Rebbe explained that external ugliness, and I use the word not because it's an objective term, but external ugliness mirrors internal ugliness. In other words, we don't know if Rabbi Lazar saw on his face just a structurally ugly face, or he saw an internal ugliness that expressed itself in the way that, you can have a person that doesn't have the most beautiful face in the world, but they dress themselves nicely, they present themselves nicely, they speak nicely, and that makes them more beautiful than their physical physique. And then you can have a beautiful person who presents themselves as a nasty human being, and it diminishes from their beauty, right? So Rabbi Lazar sees the person. Sure, it's expressed in a physical ugliness, but what he sees, what he notices is a spiritual ugliness. And he notices that this ugliness comes from an ego and a haughtiness that's unwarranted, but you can't talk to such a person. You can't reason with such a person. You got to break them, right? So he tries to offend him. In other words, to put him, who do you think you are? You're so ugly, right? He wants to try to move him down a step and to remind him, you're walking around like this. You don't remember there's a God in the world. You don't remember you have a purpose. You have a mission. Who do you think you are? What's the person's response? Go to God. No, it's God made me. In other words, he's telling Rabbi Lazar, I'm not as bad as you think I am. Rabbi Lazar looked at him and saw ugliness. In other words, a person devoid of God, someone who is egotistical and haughty, devoid of God. And the proper response to that is to beat him up, not physically, to break him, right? But this person turns to Rabbi Lazar and says, I'm not as broken as you think. I'm not as haughty as you think I am. I know I come from, go to God. This is the way God made me. So now Rabbi Elazar realizes he jumped too fast. In other words, he did the right thing sort of based on his perception at the time, but he obviously didn't do enough research to find out, was this person truly as haughty as he thought? Did he truly need that treatment? So eventually this person forgives Rabbi Elazar, but what's his condition? Think before you do this again. He doesn't say never do this again. He doesn't say never tell a person how ugly they are. Some people need to hear that. Some people need to know that the ego, the haughtiness they have is unwarranted. They're not as great as they think they are. There is a God. Remember God. They need to be told that they need to be broken. But be sure before you react that way. So this is the Alter Rebbe concluding here, basically, the what a person should do if he's trying to serve God and it's not working, it's not catching fire. His body, his animal soul is fighting against the forces of his godly soul. What do? You gotta break. Here, there's nothing. You meditate from today till tomorrow, which was the MO up until now. It's not gonna work. Here, you got to break the person. Okay, before the Alter Rebbe is going to conclude with sort of more of a general idea. What happens, we said before that a person, whether consciously or even subconsciously, has faith, believes, right? Every Jew believes. And yet, many times we have questions. We have things that come up that question our faith. Judaism doesn't shy away from questions. Doesn't shy away from it. Right? Passover Seder, we ask many questions. The whole Seder is about answering questions. So if a person has doubts, shouldn't they just open the books and try to talk their way out of doubts? And yet, what do we find by the Seder? 4 sons, right? The second son is the wicked son. How do you respond to the wicked son? What does the Haggadah say you tell the wicked son? Remember? So the wise son has a question. You should instruct him the laws. Okay, you should tell him the answer. The wicked son, what does he say? What is this bothersome ritual service to you? Yeah. He says to you, but not to himself. As he's trying to disconnect himself. So what should you do? It doesn't say you should say something. In a minute it will. What should you do? You should therefore also blunt his teeth and say to him, it is because of this that God did for me when I left Egypt. In other words, answer him. But before you answer him, punch, right? Break his teeth, blunt his teeth. What type of response is that? Sounds odd, right? But based on what we're learning here, makes perfect sense. This wicked person, what's he saying? He's trying to say, me and God, not necessarily a connection. I've got my own self. I'm not necessarily connected by what someone else wants of me. Before you can rationalize with such a person, before you can answer him, first you got to bring him down a notch. First you got to put him into his place. And that's what it says. It doesn't actually mean you should go to the son and punch him in his mouth. It means slow down break his teeth. In other words, make him aware of the way he's speaking and how he's not worthy of the ego he thinks he deserves, of the self righteousness he thinks he has. Break him down a bit. Most of the times, reason works. Most of the time, when someone comes with a question, we're rational people. There's a question, you give an answer. But every once in a while, we need to break the person.
Does that basically mean that you have a discussion with them to try to break that ego?
So
help them see that it's just a facade. You're just putting up a cover for who you really are.
you can have the discussion with them, but you can't break someone with a discussion. Either you have to berate them. In other words, you have to be like a parent that's going to say, if you keep on doing this, you're going to grow up to be an evil person. You're going to grow up to be a selfish person. You're going to hurt people. People are not going to like you. Sometimes a parent has to do that. Sometimes a teacher has to do that to a child that really is stuck in his own selfishness. You got to break him out. If the person's a little more older, a little more mature, wants to do this on his own, so we study Tanya, right? Alter Rebbe is having a conversation with me. The Alter Rebbe is not berating me, but he's teaching me how to berate my own animal soul. He's teaching me how to talk down to what's getting in the way of me living my potential. So sometimes it's a conversation that you have with someone else to train them how to berate, because if you berate them, not always will it work. Moses didn't always berate the Jewish people. Many times he showed them signs. He didn't need to. By the spies, he saw the need. He went down on them, and that worked. But if you're going to try to, you see someone walking down the street doing something that needs telling, and you're going to start berating them, that's not going to help. They're going to look at you. They're going to think you're crazy. But if you teach them what's wrong, why is this happening, what's going on, and how they themselves can remind themselves of what the real essence is, what's the truth, and what's just a facade, what's just there to give them the ability to choose freely, that will help them put themselves in a position that they can react properly. There was a yeshiva student from one of the famous Lithuanian yeshivas before the war that left yeshiva and sort of joined enlightenment, went off the path of Torah. And one time he was visiting, or he came back, and he went to his teacher, to the head of his yeshiva, and he said, I have some questions. Maybe you can answer. So the head of the yeshiva said, I answer questions. I don't answer answers. In other words, you're coming, you want to debate with me. You have your conclusions, you have your answers. I can't answer answers. If you have a question you want to understand, then I can help you with. I can't debate. That's what I tell every once in a while. Someone who isn't Jewish wants to come and learn and study, and 99% of the time they want to come, they want to learn. But every once in a while, someone comes and they want to compare and contrast. They want to they want to know what they're not trying to convert you, but they want to prove or disprove or compare or contrast. And so when someone comes, I always tell them, listen, if you're coming to listen to learn, you don't need to be quiet. You can ask questions. But if you're coming to learn and understand, I can answer questions. But if someone already has foregone conclusions, they already have the answers, you can't teach such a person. Okay, so let's finish here. On page 401, every person in whose mind there occurs doubt. So this is, again, going back to more a general thing. Every person in whose mind there occurs doubts concerning faith in God can deduce from this episode of the spies that these doubts are nothing but the empty words of the Sitra Achra, which raises itself against his divine soul. But Israelites themselves, in other words, their godly soul, which is their essence, are believers. Furthermore, the Sitra Achra itself entertains no doubts at all concerning faith. Because remember, as explained in chapter 22, the Klippa in its spiritual state, in other words, when it's not clothed in the human body, does not deny God's sovereignty. It's a creation of God. It has merely been granted permission to confuse man with false, deceitful words, in order that he may be more richly rewarded for mastering it. In this, it is similar to the harlot who attempts to seduce the king's son through falsehood and deceit with the king's approval, as in the parable narrated in the Holy Zohar. Remember this from chapter 9? Remember this parable? Yeah. So the harlot in this scenario, she's not a bad person. She doesn't want the king's son to be seduced, but if she doesn't try hard enough, she's not doing what the king wants her to do. She's failing the king. So she has, on the one hand, she has to try very hard. She has to try her best. And that's why the Sitra Achra, the Klippa, the animal soul, tries its hardest. But that's not what it really wants. That's not its real identity. It really wants to do what God wants. It really wants this person to overcome it. And then it has fulfilled what the king wants, what the king's true desire. Okay, so I think we've concluded a little bit this topic. However, in the next chapter, we're going to discuss how a person should deal with his sort of negative character traits when it comes to. So here we're dealing with his issues between him and God. Next chapter, we're going to talk about issues that occur between one person and another person. How to humble the person that they can have humility towards another person, not just towards God. Because I can say that I'm not worthy of this haughtiness in God's presence. It's not as easy to say that in front of someone else's presence, especially if you know you're certain that person is not worthy of my respect. There's no objective world in which I'm not better than them. So how can I be humble in front of someone else? That we'll talk about in the coming weeks.